Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the warm welcome to Denver and to the Greater Greener Conference. My name is Stuart Mackinnon, and I have the honor and privilege of being an elected commissioner and the chair of the Vancouver Board of Parks and Recreation, one of the only elected boards in Canada. I'm excited to be here to share our experience with supporting nature and urban biodiversity in Vancouver's park system. And it's the green button. Thank you. I would like to begin. Thank you. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional ancestral territory of the Arapaho and Cheyenne people, and that I also acknowledge the other Indigenous peoples of Colorado, including the Apache, Comanche, Shoshone, and Ute. As you can see from this photo, Vancouver is truly a city at the foot of the mountains and the edge of the sea. Nature is part of the culture of Vancouver. The Vancouver Park Board was established in 1888, separate from the City of Vancouver, to oversee Vancouver Park System. It manages 238 parks across the city, covering 3,588 acres, or 12% of the terrestrial portion of the city. Almost all of Vancouver's natural areas, forests, wetlands, shorelines, and beaches are located in city parks. There are almost no important natural areas in private ownership, which is quite different than most developing cities. This satellite image helps put the city of Vancouver in context. While the city of Vancouver is the most well-known of the 21 municipalities, it is only part of a much broader urbanization region called Metro Vancouver at the mouth of the Fraser River. This image also highlights how important the Fraser River and the Salish Sea is to the character of Vancouver. The landscape we call Vancouver has been the home of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people since time immemorial. The Park Board was created early in the city of Vancouver's existence, intended to manage one park, Stanley Park. The City and Park Board proceeded to evict the people living there in their ancient villages within the newly created park. This was the first act of colonial violence on the part of the Park Board towards the local Indigenous peoples. The process of cultural erasure of the First Peoples continued throughout the history of Vancouver parks. In recognition of this history and in the interest of honoring the truth part of truth and reconciliation, the board passed a motion in July of 2018 to undertake a colonial audit of the institution's past and present practices and policies. Another important point of context is that Vancouver developed before stream and wetland protection and other regulations were in place to protect the environment. I have three images that illustrate the development of False Creek, the small tidal inlet that is in the heart of Vancouver. This image shows the edge of False Creek in 1902, with the current downtown in the background. It was an amazingly rich landscape of tidal flats, marshes, and small streams that supported salmon, waterfowl, and tall forests. By 1936, almost half of False Creek had been filled in to make way for railways and industry. Lumber mills and shipbuilding lined the shore, covering over the intertidal zone and dumping their waste into the creek. In 1913, the First Nations residents of Kitsilano, near the mouth of False Creek, were forced to relocate, and their homes were burned. But work on many fronts in recent decades has reversed some of the industrial legacy. Shorelines are being restored, like this island that was created as part of Vancouver's Olympic Village. And rainwater management and sewer separation is being used to improve water quality. Dense and walkable neighborhoods have replaced the industry of the last century. The Vancouver Park Board is also currently developing a new park in one of the last undeveloped shorelines in False Creek that has reconciliation with First Nations at the heart of the design process. The Vancouver Park Board has led the city's efforts to support biodiversity and improve access to nature. A comprehensive biodiversity strategy was adopted by the Park Board and City Council in April of 2016, which expanded on the Greenest City Action Plan and jump-started corporate interest in biodiversity as a key part of urban sustainability. The strategy included a citywide biodiversity target to create or restore 25 hectares of natural area by 2020, a target we have already surpassed. Thank you. Biodiversity is only one of the many sustainability targets of the city and the Park Board work on as part of the Greenest City Action Plan that was adopted in 2011. They include energy, transportation, water, green buildings, and local food. The biodiversity target is part of the Access to Nature goal that also includes targets to substantially increase Vancouver's urban forest. The next slides highlight the range of projects and initiatives that Vancouver Park Board has led or supported to meeting the overlapping goals of increasing natural areas in parks, restoring biodiversity, and enhancing access to nature. I'll run through them fairly quickly. This is a 4-acre salt marsh and marine riparian zone in New Brighton Park that was completed in 2017 in partnership with the Port of Vancouver. It supports migrating salmon as they move through Burrard Inlet. And if you're wondering what the orange fencing is for, it's to protect the salt marsh plants from browsing by Canada geese. The restored shoreline and new swimming beach in Jericho Park replaced an old creosote pile supported structure that was a legacy of military use of the Jericho area. This was completed about a decade ago as one of the Park Board's first initiatives to restore shoreline areas affected by historical industrial use. This is a temporary or pop-up park created on 2 city lots with themes of pollinator enhancement and use of recycled materials. We call it a pop-up park because the whole city block will eventually be developed into a neighborhood park over the next 5 years. We're also finding ways to turn mowed grass into flower-rich meadow for pollinators throughout the park system. Chum salmon now return every November to spawn in Still Creek in East Vancouver. This is partly the result of the improving health of Still Creek and partly because of the improvements to fish passage downstream sections of the creek. It's one of the small wonders of the natural world to see fish that spent their lives feeding along the Aleutian Islands to spawn behind a hardware store in East Vancouver. Right outside the Stanley Park offices of the Park Board is one of the largest urban great blue heron nesting colonies in North America. About 160 herons have nested at this site since 2001, and we have cameras that allow viewing without disturbing the nesting herons. And here we have herring eggs that are now being laid within False Creek. Another indication of the improvement to the marine food web around Vancouver in the past decade is that orcas are increasingly more common. This is a pod of transient whales that pass through English Bay and Burrard Inlet. Marine birds are at risk from marine pollution and tanker spills, as well from disturbance from boats and people. The Vancouver Park Board developed a citywide bird strategy to enhance the marine and terrestrial bird populations. As you can see from these projects, the Vancouver Park Board plays an essential role in Vancouver's reconciliation and sustainability efforts and leads work on biodiversity and access to nature. But these are also the long-term initiatives that will require work over decades to be successful. Our commitment to biodiversity is focusing on 4 key areas: improving relations with local First Nations, whose rights entitled to the area now called Vancouver remain unceded and internationally protected; pivoting away from the traditional focus on the terrestrial part of Vancouver to emphasize marine ecosystems, shorelines, and the Fraser River; combining climate mitigation and adaptation goals with biodiversity, more urban forests, sequestering carbon in intertidal wetlands, and rebuilding resilient shorelines for sea level rise, and recognizing the intrinsic value of nature for the physical and mental health of our community. We want to make biodiversity part of the everyday life of Vancouver. And finally, I want to finish up by stating that I believe Vancouver has the finest park planners anywhere. You might say the same about your planners, but as an elected commissioner, I can't say enough about the education, the dedication, knowledge, and professionalism of our staff. I want to thank Dave Hutch, Rena Sutar, Justin Dykstra, and Katerina Gomez, who are with me here today, to Nick Page, who put this presentation together, and all the planners and workers of the Vancouver Board of Parks and Recreation, for they truly make Vancouver one of the most livable cities in the world. Thank you very much.
So before we start our next presentation, I want to interject. There was a slide earlier that we went through pretty quickly that shows you that you can be submitting questions as we go. So if you go to the app and you click on schedule for today and you find the plenary session, that is where you will start entering questions that we can actually ask the speakers when we're all done. Okay? So we will move on to our next speaker. I actually don't know how to work this. Is it okay? Back. There we go. That's the right slide for you.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, first of all, thanks a lot for the kind invitation to participate in this so prestigious forum. I'm very proud representing my European city, Vitoria Gasteiz, and explaining shortly the planning processes and some implementation projects developed to enhance biodiversity in our city. So, the question today is how to plan and design a more biophilic city that takes into account and promote biodiversity. We started 30 years ago designing an utopic green belt that would allow a continuous network of natural parks in the degraded peripheries of the city at that time. And that's what we are going to talk about. But before, let me introduce my city, Vitoria Gasteiz, current capital of the Basque Country, a medium-sized and compact city that presents good income and socio-economic indicators, for example, the GDP or life expectancy, the top of the world with Japan, almost 84 years. And specifically, ecological ones such as 46 square meters of green areas per inhabitant, 100% of the population living at less than 30 meters from a green area bigger than 2 hectares. In 2012, we were awarded as European Green Capital by the European Commission, which has had a strong impact at the local level and as well at an international context as ambassadors of the greener European cities. Well, a first message from our city would be the need to remember the interdependence of biodiversity and ecosystem services with other urban policies in order to advance towards a more sustainable city model. A green city is much more than big parks, That's the meaning of the European Green Capital Award, and you can see all the items that we need to overcome to be green capital. A second message would be the necessary contextualization when we work for urban biodiversity in the bioregional scale. It is necessary to know which are the main biotic sources, the main natural processes out of the city, to be able to work in their conservation and in their better natural connections with urban system. In this image, we see in a small circle our city inside a big and green bioregion just in the Basque Country core, where 70% of land is protected for the natural value. We also see our situation in a hot spot of biodiversity in Spain. That multi-scale vision is crucial and must overcome administrative local borders in ecological planning. Of course, we must highlight at that point the importance of the urban peripheries as main places of conflict, but also as ecotones with enormous potential. This is where we focused our main efforts at the beginning of the 19th, designing a multifunctional green belt that would allow to restore the degraded peripheral landscapes we had at that time, and move from a set of isolated parks to a functional connected system. This meant, for example, transforming problems of flooding or environmental degradation, as we can see on these images, into life solutions. Here we can see how Greenbelt Parks protects an urban and industrial area from flooding with the yellow line, and how a very simplified landscape is transformed in a new flooded park with a great biodiversity. The success of the pilot projects in the new green belt stimulate new ones, such as this project to create an urban ecological corridor in a new district in the east part of the city, specifically designed for the recovery of endangered species, such as the European mink, for example, that was supported with an European project like Lutreola. This is one of the small mammals more threatened at the global level, near extinction. The result is, therefore, a set of parks that restore highly degraded spaces and protect the urban and industrial areas from flooding, but also generating new fantastic opportunities for wildlife. And of course, for the citizens who enjoy them biking or walking or in 1,000 ways. There are also suitable spaces for education and citizen awareness, as well as for promoting social interaction and integration. In the year 2000, we had so good biodiversity indicators that the wetlands restored in the Greenbelt were protected internationally by means of its inclusion in the European Natura 2000 network and in the International Ramsar Convention for the Protection of Wetlands worldwide. This is only 20 minutes far walking from our medieval city center. The result has been of great interest to the broadest economic sector of the city as well, because of the added economic value to neighborhoods and adjacent homes. Logically, also to the tourism sector and to the entrepreneurs of international relations. See some mayors from Chinese cities in the picture. In 2012, the European Commission started work in its green urban infrastructure strategy on the left, and we too on the right, with the intention of progressively introducing the philosophy and the life of the green belt into the interior city. For this, logically, we rely on the water system, in the green system of public and private green areas, and facilitate the permeability of nature from the green belt to the city, to the interior city, by restoring and enhancing new ecological connectors, as you see, following the theories of landscape ecology applied to the urban fabric. The launching of this strategy coincides with the celebration of the European Green Capital in 2012, and the mayor at that time proposed to develop an interior green ring encouraged by the success of the original, and begins by dilating from the sewage system the old Batan River, right in the heart of the city. This project symbolized the welcome of the countryside into the city and the beginning of a policy of urban renaturalization. Here we can see also the entrance of natural connectors to the city and how before were incorporated into the sewage system on the right. We can see here some designs and simulations prepared at that time, looking for citizens' understanding and implication. This nature-based solutions project presented a radical transformation of the public space and affected multiple biophysical variables: mobility, energy, hydraulics, public use, biodiversity, in line with the European Green Capital Award and with the European Green Infrastructure Strategy and philosophy. Essentially, thus this meant a radical transformation, a radical conversion from a private car-oriented public space, totally paved, to a nature and people-oriented public space. For example, looked on the left, the 1 million uses in the first years of biking. We show here the current situation in this main avenue with new great opportunities for people and for wildlife too, that uses not only the new river ecosystem created, but the pedestrian crossing, as you can see with this family of ducks in the medium. Finally, this image shows the last 4 mayors planting, belonging to 3 different parties, political parties, planting a tree together. And with this image, I want to highlight the importance of cooperation between citizens, stakeholders, and politicians in the success of policies that foster urban biodiversity, such as those I have presented to you today. That's all. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
And now we have our last panelist, Yvonne Lynch.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here to address you all in beautiful Denver this morning. I'm going to talk to you about Melbourne. Now, Melbourne is Australia's fastest growing city and soon to be its largest city, and it's also one of the world's most livable cities. A large component of what makes Melbourne a livable city is these beautiful parks, gardens, and tree-lined streets. However, these assets that contribute so much for us are currently under stress from climate change and urban development. Traditionally, when we think about city development, we're thinking in terms of grey infrastructure. We think about infrastructures like these. We invest countless billions without ever questioning it in roads, drains, railways, buildings, but we rarely invest the same in creating our green infrastructures that are so critical to life. So let me show you Melbourne. This is an aerial image of Melbourne in 1988. Green cover ratio 24.6%. What happens over 2 decades as we develop? we lose half of our green cover. Now this is a way cities think about themselves. This is a necessary trade-off for progress, right? No. If you look at Singapore, a city that's had a very strong, firm commitment to urban greening since the 1960s, look at Singapore in 1986, same time frame as Melbourne. What happens over 2 decades as they develop and grow their city by 2 million people? They increase their green cover by more than 10%. So, in Melbourne in 2011, we thought, okay, Singapore, we're going to follow your lead. And we set a vision for our city to become a city within a forest. However, we encountered significant challenges in trying to achieve this vision. For example, we undertook a health assessment of our city's trees. And what we found with the health assessment was that 44% of our trees were in a state of severe decline, and that we were going to lose them within less than 2 decades. And just to show you what that looks like, losing half a city's urban forest, this is Royal Parade in Melbourne. It's one of the city's last standing boulevards of Dutch, or the world's last standing boulevards of Dutch elm trees. And here's what it looks like without those trees. Now that's not just a loss of trees, that's a fundamental loss of cultural identity for a city. So why was that happening? Well, the trees were in decline due to water stress. Melbourne suffered through a drought for over 10 years. And to manage during that drought, we focused on water conservation to the point that we completely turned off the taps on the urban landscapes. We stopped watering the trees, we stopped watering the parks. And while we were doing that, we were letting the rain that we did fall on these beautiful bluestone pavements, take the rubbish with it out to the bay and leave it looking like this. Now the interesting thing is, while we were letting that happen, we actually had enough rainfall in the lowest rainfall year of our drought to meet supply demands for the projected population in 2050. And this is what we were doing. Meanwhile, our state government was investing $6 billion in this grey infrastructure desalination plant, and then spending another $3 billion maintaining it while it sat there unused for many years. So in addition to, I guess, a water problem in Melbourne, we also have a heat problem. Every time we have a heat wave, we lose lives. Heat is Australia's silent killer. More people die every year due to heat stress in Australia than from any other natural disaster. So in terms of achieving that green vision, I said, for our city to become a city within a forest, we had to put in place a program. We call it an ecosystem-based climate adaptation program. We have a suite of strategies, they're all integrated, working together to achieve a goal of cooling our city's summertime temperatures by 4 degrees Celsius, as well as improving livability and resilience. So how is that implemented? Of course, planting trees is really critical. So we have a goal to double the urban forest canopy cover from a current 20% right up to 40% within 2 decades. And how we're achieving that is not about announcing tree numbers, it's actually thinking about where we're putting the trees. So you can see 2 scenarios there on the screen. The green scenario shows you that if you go into a typical street and put 26 trees in a footpath, you can achieve a canopy coverage of 36% in that trees. However, if you do something controversial, like sacrifice a couple of car parking spaces, yeah, let's put those trees in the road where they've got more room to grow. 12 trees, 55% canopy cover. So it's not about announcing big numbers of trees. We're greening our laneways. Anybody who's been to Melbourne will know how important the laneways are. We've got a plan to ensure that every resident within the city is within 300 metres walking distance of a quality green space. How we're doing that? Repurposing underutilised existing infrastructures, turning grey to green, like this road in North Melbourne. And this road, which is actually in the heart of the city centre, this is South Bank Boulevard, and work is currently underway to convert it into a 2.5 hectare linear park. And to support this, of course, you need water. So the city's been working on building a stormwater harvesting infrastructure. So here's Wall Park, city's largest park, and what you can't see under the wetlands there is a really rather large stormwater harvesting tank, which is collecting water, cleaning it, and providing it again for the irrigation purposes of these landscapes. And here's what one of those stormwater harvesting tanks looks like. This is in a heritage park, Fitzroy Gardens. Here's one in a road. This is the world's first in-road stormwater harvesting system. And once you have systems like this in place, you don't even know they're there. But through this, we're sourcing almost 30% of the system, or the city's landscape water irrigation requirements. We're also diversifying our landscapes to support plant biodiversity and insect biodiversity. We're putting green roofs on our buildings. We've created a how-to guide for the private sector to do their own. This is one of the buildings that have used our how-to guide. And we've made grants available for the private sector and the community so that they can do their own greening. Here's one project. But a fundamentally critical component of all of this work is actually working collaboratively with the Melbourne community. So over 20,000 citizens have been involved in collaborating to bring this work about, from the strategies right down to the implementation on the ground. Now, if you look at this picture, you can see they're sitting at tables. They're making decisions. They're not summoned to the City Hall to listen to what's going to happen to them under the guises of collaboration or consultation. So this is really critical, and because of this, the Melbourne community are really engaged as stewards of the urban landscape in Melbourne. They asked, what can we do to implement this green vision for our city? How can we get involved? And so we set up a citizen forester program, a citizen scientist program, and allowed them to partake in activities. One of the things they did was collecting biodiversity data as part of several urban biodiversity or bioblitzes. And they collected thousands of biodiversity records, which are now used in city planning. That information has been interpreted and made available again for the community. So we have a website on the city's insects. Why insects? Well, why not? 40% of the world's insects are actually in decline. And so it's important that we start to connect people more with all levels of biodiversity in our city. We've also done this for the butterflies, and we've taken both of those website information and we've created a book that's supplied to the schools and the children in the city so they can learn about their local biodiversity. And we've started to work in a more meaningful fashion with the local Aboriginal community, trying to move beyond tokenism to meaningful action. In Australia, we've got over 40,000 years of Aboriginal knowledge and expertise, and why aren't we using it? So we're now making those steps to integrate that into city planning, doing things like recognising 7 local Aboriginal seasons in Melbourne as opposed to our 4 Western ones. One of our popular initiatives has been City of Melbourne's Urban Forest Visual. This is where you can learn about the trees, how healthy they are, how old they are. You can even email them. They've had thousands of emails from around the world. They've had personal stories, some jokes, people sharing memories. And while it's entertained many people, it's also inspired thousands of others to connect more closely to nature. And I guess finally, all of these lessons that we've learned in Melbourne are being applied across Australian cities right now. But on the largest scale, they're actually being applied in Riyadh, which is the capital of Saudi Arabia. This is a city that has invested heavily in its grey infrastructure, and it's one of the world's hottest cities. They've experienced a population explosion from 50,000 people in 1950 to 7 million people today. That's incredible. And so I've been working there with the government to apply the Melbourne practice to create 3,000 new parks, plant 70 million trees, and create a sustainable water supply for their city and their citizens. And so I want to leave you with the final thought. Now is a critical point in time with climate change, particularly for our cities, and we need to reimagine what we do and do it differently. And I think we need to move away from this traditional idea of what urban design is to what it could be. And we need to incorporate nature-based principles. And I think what we need to move to is nature-sensitive urban design. Thank you.
So I see questions are flying in. Please feel free to add. I'm not in charge here. Karen, should Nilon come up? You're more than welcome to come up, I think. Yeah. Yay, Nilon! All right. So these are truly remarkable examples of achieving urban sustainability and paths for increasing biodiversity. Thank you all for this. What we often do not hear about, however, are the challenges and failures that are overcome on the path to success. Can you all share with us some of the more challenging times and what it took to overcome those obstacles? You can't hear me. Okay. Did anybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So there are challenges and failures that maybe you needed to overcome in your success stories. So we're just trying to pull out, because it's great to see the success stories, but at the same time, I think we'd also like to hear about those challenging times that you had, maybe some failures. Failures do happen, right?
Go ahead.
All right. Sure, I'll start. I'm an elected official, which means I am responsible to the people. And as we're finding change happening very, very quickly in our cities, change becomes a challenge. And lots of people in their neighborhoods don't like change. And they want to keep things the way they are, even though they may not be sustainable. And so as we're moving through this change in Vancouver, we're having a lot of pushback, especially from the more wealthy neighborhoods and the more established neighborhoods. We've been wonderfully lucky at the Park Board in Vancouver to have, as I said earlier, such fantastic staff to have brought us new reports of what's happening around the world and what's relevant to Vancouver. And so we're being able to slowly educate the population and bring them along, but we still have a lot of pushback on change in our neighborhoods.
I think I might add to that. I mean, it's a very important thing for cities in terms of how they work with their communities. And certainly in Melbourne, we had very bad news to share with our community before we had to, bring them some good ideas. But we were very transparent. We put our hands up and said, we failed, but let's work together to do something better for our city. And I think certainly as city governments, we need to be a little bit more transparent and work harder to make information accessible to our communities and to give them genuine opportunities. So I think one of the challenges certainly I faced in Melbourne was with community engagement and trying to extend it beyond what the typical timeframes were of 6 weeks. I mean, I talked about community engagement there, but that was a 4-year program. You can't do community engagement in a couple of weeks, and I think how we're working with our communities is really critical. I might say as well, just in terms of failure, when we started implementing this plan in Melbourne, we would plant a certain number of trees every year, and then we would replace almost a third of those trees. And this has been something that had been happening, and I've since found out it's something that happens in most cities. And it's like, well, why would you pay again to replace your trees? Like, why aren't we creating the right conditions for them to grow in the first place. So understanding implementation on the ground and how you fund maintenance and how you fund some of these things properly is very important.
Well, I'll try to answer in English, asking for your patience and well, I'll try. This is a good question because my mind is completely full of bad experiences. Even we call sometimes our green belt, that is our most famous icon, as a history of pulses. We have had many interventions. We checked more than 105 that were prepared for the public or by the private systems to go not in a sustainable way in the peripheries. As you can know, most of the proposals for invading, for sprawling the territory are absolutely against this nature protection of borders or connections with the bioregional matrix. Then we have had many bad problems, many struggles to ensure that the plan we have, that utopia we designed 30 years ago, turned to reality. The support, the politicians and the political support has been crucial at that moment because most of different parties were agreed to continue this way towards sustainability. Now, being green capital of Europe is easier, and there is three holes that we can go back. We must advance, only advance in sustainable ways.
Thank you. I'm gonna try something like you did, like walk out here. Can you guys hear me if I'm out here? And can you hear me over here? Okay, great. I'm glad I learned to project. So just on this trend and this theme of challenges, we do know that although trees provide us with lots of benefits, vegetation and green infrastructure can also provide us with some negative impacts. There can be disservices, so to speak. So, you know, in your presentations, you talked about some of these, like water consumption, like the trade-off with water, which is an issue right here for us in the Front Range. But gentrification of neighborhoods is also in our backyards. Sometimes there's increased crime in parks and open spaces. So can you comment on some of the policies and strategies that you have for reducing these disservices, or even working with people to overcome these disservices? Did everyone hear that? Yeah. Okay.
I might start. Certainly one of the things that happened in Melbourne was we had particular parks that people wouldn't go to because they weren't inviting places because of the activities that would go on in those places. But with the urban bioblitzes, where you have thousands of people frequenting a place to gather data, started to change a little bit the nature of those places, that's for sure. I think in terms of gentrification, I remember at one point someone said to me from our state government, your urban forest plan is not really a great idea because you're just going to further gentrify Melbourne and it's a bad thing. And so my response to that was, well, actually, we're talking about canopy cover across the city. We're talking about more parks across the city, everywhere. So we're trying to make it available at every level. And if we're all working in that way, then we should be overcoming some of those gentrification issues. And I think we know that, like most cities in the world, what you'll find is those greener areas are where you have generally your wealthier, higher educated population. And I think it's time that we definitely start to challenge that. So, yeah.
So I'll talk about three things here. A success. The Vancouver Park Board has had for the last few years $10 tree sales, where we have trees that people can come and purchase. It's been a huge success. People from all over the city come. It's a good price. They're drought-resistant species, and we have some that you can put on a balcony as well as in your garden. Gentrification, but more importantly in Vancouver, densification is becoming a huge challenge for us. We have to rethink what parks are, what people want to do in their parks. The idea of passive great lawns is gone. Our parks aren't that way anymore, although they have some importance as well. But we are increasingly densifying, and so that our public spaces and our parks become the meeting places for people, and there have to be multi-purpose spaces. One of the greatest challenge that we're facing in Vancouver, and I'm sure cities throughout North America and perhaps around the world, is homelessness. And so we have homeless people who are now setting up tents in our parks because there is nowhere else for them to go. This is not an issue that the Park Board can solve, nor even in Canada at the city level. This is a senior government level. But until that happens, until there is space for people, our public parks will continue to be spaces where homeless people will congregate and set up tents. We're dealing with this right now. It's a huge challenge at a park board level. We want to have respect and compassion, but we also want to understand that parks are for everyone. It's a huge challenge.
Well, in our case, the problem we had was the excess of water. Then we imagined the peripheral parks as parts to solve the problem, as shown in our presentation, and trying to protect the city from that excess of water that also meant more biodiversity. Well, the second question is that urban parks, from my point of view, need people, need a density, a minimum density. We have a density of 80 flats per hectare that ensure that we have a mixture of people inside parks. And the third question is that people must adapt to nature. No, we adapt parks for urban and civic people. That meant that we can prepare for the future parks with incredible increasing index of biodiversity if we have people educating in that way.
So on that note, the audience would like to know if you've how have you dealt with naysayers? So as you've been moving forward, how do you talk to people about choosing animals and nature over people, or convince them that you're not doing something like that?
All right. Since I first became a park advocate 20 years ago, my motto has always been people and nature in balance. It doesn't always work that way. Society is changing, our morals are changing, our enlightenment is rising. Being in an elected position, I take the risk every time I vote that some of the people in the city won't agree with me, and if more people disagree than agree, I will be out. I was first elected in 2008. In 2011, the voters, in their infinite wisdom, gave me a vacation. But I was re-elected in 2014 and again in 2018. One of the biggest issues that probably hurt me in 2011 was the issue of cetaceans in captivity. We have an aquarium, a world-famous aquarium. It's an incredible place, but we had cetaceans in captivity, and I was one of the people who championed to end that practice. It was, thank you. I was just a little bit ahead of my time. We have now ended the practice in Vancouver. We have renegotiated with our aquarium, and they have realized that the population doesn't want to see this. But that's the danger. But I've thought that if you really truly believe in something, that's what you present to the people. And if you are ahead of your time, then perhaps you just have to wait a little longer, and it will happen.
Well, thank you for your patience.
I guess from a Melbourne perspective, I mean, and in any city, there's always naysayers, and so there should be. But what you often find is there are minority voices that just seem to be a little bit louder than everybody else's. They're well-versed and well-practiced, and usually your city planners know who they are. And often, it's true. Often the thing is that you can develop a fear of these people. Oh, this person's going to say this, or they're going to write to the mayor, and then we're going to have to do this. And I think how we overcame that in Melbourne was being, I guess, two things. Giving a plan or a strategy time to sit with the community before advancing it, and being transparent. So making data available, but bringing the community together to participate. So just going beyond the traditional consultation methods. So we used techniques like we would gather people, maybe this many people in a room, and we would have, desks, and they would work together, but they would lead the agenda. We would be very conscious not to design an agenda for the community, to let them lead, and often what you find is they regulate themselves. So those naysayers that, if they're right, they'll have everyone agree with them, but often they're not. And you have a whole different members of the community standing up and taking on that argument with them, so you don't have to do that. I think it's our job to listen and to understand, and really to kind of become more sophisticated in the way that we integrate our communities into the work that we do, rather than thinking we're the policymakers, we're the planners, and we know the right things for you.
It's a very difficult question. As managers of green areas, we know very well that there are more biophobic people in the city than biophilic one. Or at least they call more to the telephone number of the municipality. When we talk about biodiversity, we talk in a broad sense, and someone is thinking wild, big and nice animals as cerfs or this nice European mink or something like that, no? And not in the crucial species for example, pollination. When I talk about pollination to my mayor, I must run away fast to the steps down. No? Well, it's not easy. In our case, we had the chance that work 30 years ago in the peripheries, there were no people, and we could first design paths for biodiversity. And after arrived people, and people arrived when we had very stabilized ecosystems, and we prepared very good capacity building strategies for people to ensure that the contact was okay, increasing city dwellers in parks are also not declining biodiversity index. This is the play we need to do the next years, not only in cities, but in the whole world, to balance that, more people and no less biodiversity.
These are all excellent answers. Thank you so much. But so far, Charlie, we bring him up on stage and he's been quiet. So
I can talk about
you want to talk about that? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think on the last one,
They can't hear you, so you might have to step up here.
because she was waiting desperately to try to get him to pull on the ladder.
Okay.
Well, I think on the last question, at least the city where I live and work, I think in Columbia, I think one of the big challenges in terms of naysayers are that to some extent the city has kind of a split personality, because Columbia has a very pro-growth, pro-development sort of philosophy in terms of planning, and they also, so the information on biodiversity, information on nature, all those kinds of things are in the plan, but there are really no tools for implementing it. So I think one of the challenges has been that I think the public often is sort of given the choice of it's one or the other. And again, I don't work for the city, I work at the university, so I'm saying it's an outsider sort of, but I think that there's a view that somehow biodiversity, and that there's plenty of it around, there are state parks, the state conservation areas, it matters in the city, but not a whole lot, so that all the other things you can do are more important. So I think that's a challenge. And I'll say how to answer that, just say it's a challenge. So that would be my comment.
There are not easy answers to any of these questions, especially this next one. So no one has yet said the words climate change. How do you see the connection to biodiversity?
Well, I mean, they're fundamentally linked. I think I did say climate change many times. And I'll also tell you I do work in Saudi Arabia at the moment, and I say climate change a lot. I think in terms of where we are right now as cities, we're in a very critical point. And climate change is affecting our biodiversity in many ways. And I guess you have to understand your local biodiversity in your place, and you have to do the work to start to increase, I guess, citizen knowledge levels about biodiversity and why it's important. And I think I showed you a slide on insects earlier. Globally, 40% of the world's insect species are declining, and they're declining at a rate that's 8 times faster than everything else. And so in cities, we design ourselves in a way that we kind of don't want any uncomfortable things around us, right? And often insects are uncomfortable for people. And so, I mean, we did a lot of work to try and promote insects as, beneficiary, or people being beneficiaries of the work that insects do in our cities, to try and, have them perceive insects as something that are friendly and not always something that are scary. I mean, particularly in a place like Australia, where one spider bite can literally kill you in a second. So, yeah, but I mean, how common is that? We hear these stories, and that's what people cling to, but then there's all the other good stories. And we engaged an amazing urban ecologist from Spain, actually, to do a lot of work on understanding the insects in Melbourne. And what he found was 97% of what's in the city is actually native, and they're doing good work. And that other 3% are causing those disservices. So, things like that are important, I think.
That is a great answer. We're also running out of time, so maybe you want to add in your 2 cents quickly.
Well, it's not easy to talk about a lot of things in 10 minutes, no? But the climate change was behind the Green City Award and the interdependence between all these biophysical variables. We are working logically, as almost every city now in the world, trying to be a neutral sea carbon in the next 20, 30 years, and biodiversity logically has a great relation with that issue. It's obvious.
Well, since the climate change debate has finally been settled, we can work on climate mitigation. Vancouver is a sea-bound city where we have water on three sides. This is incredibly important for us. Sea level rise is going to impact us in a tremendous way. And so the Vancouver Board of Parks and Recreation, long before there was even an idea of a green movement, was a green organization. That is what is at the heart of what Parks and Rec do. It's so wonderful. So we are working on sea level rise. We have a wonderful seawall that goes around most of our city, and we're working on renewing that. We're looking at different species, more planting, changing, as I said, the way our parks are designed, encouraging homeowners to keep their trees. One of the problems with densification, it doesn't just mean that we're putting more buildings up, but we have a lot of the old smaller houses becoming huge houses, in which case that they take down the trees and whatnot. So we're trying to stop that and trying to encourage people to plant more and to make it as diverse as possible. It's a huge problem, and not just in Vancouver, but around the world. But it's conferences like this that are going to be part of the solution, where we can get together and talk to each other and find out what are the successes in Denver, what are the successes in Melbourne. Well, this is what we're doing in Vancouver.
Excellent. Do you want to say something?
I was mentioning one thing that we've worked on at MU is looking at biodiversity as kind of a lens of how people can relate to climate change, because in Missouri and a lot of the Midwest, the climate change associated with climate change are fairly subtle. So in other words, we have severe storms all the time. We have flash flooding. We have heat waves. So a lot of the things you think of as being in the Midwest are kind of subtle. So basically, biodiversity is one way that people can see changes. They can see changes in plants. They can see those kinds of things. And there's several of my colleagues in the Parks and Rec Department at MU have been working with Columbia Parks and Rec, as well as Missouri State Parks, on sort of some tools that park managers can use to interpret climate change to visitors, things like that, so that they can better understand what they're seeing.
Excellent answers. And I agree with you that it's conferences like this where we come up with solutions. And I think that's a really great way to end this panel session, because we have some social time after this. And there are a lot of questions from the audience that we didn't get to address, but I think we can talk about them outside. Thank you for being here and for sharing your experiences with us.